You were never like the other kids, and you knew it. Not in the way a child knows they are smarter or faster or more talented than the people around them. In a different way entirely. A quieter way, a deeper way. A way that had nothing to do with ability and everything to do with something you could feel but could not name. Something that sat in your chest like a secret that no one had given you the words for yet. You were different and you felt it and you could not explain it, and nobody around you could explain it either. And so most of them just called you sensitive, called you strange, called you too much or not enough or somewhere in between. And you carried that with you for years, maybe decades, maybe all the way into the room you are sitting in right now. But what if the difference was never a defect? What if what made you feel like you did not belong was the very thing that marked you as chosen? What if God had his hand on you before you ever knew his name? This teaching is going to show you 7 signs that he did. And by the time it is done, your childhood is going to make sense for the first time. Stay with me. Subscribe if you have not already, and do not go anywhere. This one is going to change everything. Sign 1. You always felt different from everyone around you and could never fully explain why. Not different like a quirk. Not different like a personality trait that made you slightly more introverted than your classmates, or slightly more interested in books than in sports, or slightly more sensitive than the average child in your household. Different in a way that went so much deeper than any of those surface explanations that using them to describe it always felt like a lie. Like you were handing someone a counterfeit answer to a question that deserved the real one. You felt different in your bones, different in the way you experienced the world around you, in the way things landed on you that seemed to pass clean through everyone else, in the way you could walk into a room and feel the atmosphere of it before a single word had been spoken, in the way other people's pain attached itself to you and stayed long after you had left their presence. You felt different in the way you thought about life, about death, about God, about what everything meant and whether it meant anything at all. Asking questions at 8 years old that most adults spend their entire lives avoiding because the questions are too large and too uncomfortable and too insistent for a life built around the comfortable and the manageable. And the world around you did not know what to do with that difference. The adults in your life, even the ones who loved you genuinely and meant you no harm, did not have the framework to receive what you were carrying. They saw the sensitivity and called it weakness. They saw the depth and called it overthinking. They saw the way you did not quite fit the mold of what a normal, socially well-adjusted, emotionally appropriately calibrated child was supposed to look like. And they tried, with the best intentions, to sand you down into a shape that made more sense to them. Be more like the other kids. Stop taking everything so seriously. You do not have to feel everything so deeply. And you tried. God knows you tried. You spent years trying to make yourself smaller, trying to turn down the volume on something that was not a volume you could control, trying to fit into a shape that was never designed for you because the shape you were designed for had not been revealed to you yet. But here is what nobody told you. Here is what the adults in your life could not tell you because they did not know it themselves. The difference you felt was not a malfunction. It was a marker. It was the fingerprint of a God who had already been in your life before your parents knew your name, who had already set you apart before you took your first breath, who had already established a purpose over your existence that was so specific, so intentional, so categorically unlike the purposes he had established over the lives of the people around you, that of course you felt different. You were different, not better, not superior, not more valuable in the kingdom economy than any other person who bears the image of God, but different in the specific sense of set apart, of marked, of carrying an assignment that required a particular kind of interior architecture that God had to build into you from the very beginning because the calling that was coming would demand it. Jeremiah 1:5 is the verse most people quote in this conversation, and it deserves to be quoted again here because it is not merely a comforting word for the chosen who feel different. It is a direct and unambiguous statement about the mechanics of how God works in the lives of the people he calls. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I sanctified you. I ordained you a prophet to the nations. Before the womb, before the formation, before the first cell divided and the first heartbeat sounded and the first breath was drawn, God knew. He sanctified, which means he set apart. He ordained, which means he established the purpose and the calling with a specificity that was not general or vague, but as precise as the person being called. Jeremiah did not become different in the womb. He was known before it. He was set apart before it. The difference was established before the person existed to carry it, which means the difference you have felt your entire life is not something that happened to you. It is something that was decided about you before you arrived. The chosen who felt different in childhood almost always describe a specific and recurring experience of looking at the people around them and feeling a gap that they could not bridge no matter how hard they tried. Not a gap of intelligence or ability, but a gap of orientation, of what mattered, of what felt urgent and weighty and significant versus what the people around them seemed perfectly content to give their full attention to. The things that consumed the energy and the conversation and the social currency of their peers felt to the chosen child like standing in shallow water when something in them was pulling toward the deep. They participated in the surface things because participation was required for survival in the social world of childhood and adolescence. But there was always a part of them that was somewhere else. Always a part of them that was oriented toward something they could not yet see clearly, but could feel with a consistency that never fully left them, even in the seasons when they tried hardest to ignore it. This is not romanticizing a difficult childhood. Some of the chosen who felt different in childhood felt it in ways that were genuinely painful, that produced real loneliness, real confusion, real wounds that have not fully healed even now. The isolation that comes from being different when you are young and do not yet have the context to understand why is not a small thing. It leaves marks. It shapes the way you receive and relate to people. It creates patterns of self-protection and self-concealment that can follow the chosen person into adulthood and into their relationship with God in ways that take real work and real grace to dismantle. This teaching is not going to minimize any of that. But it is going to say this: the pain of the difference was real, and the purpose of the difference was also real, and the two things are not mutually exclusive. God did not cause the pain of the isolation to be enjoyable, but He did allow the experience of feeling different, of not quite belonging, of existing at a slight but persistent angle to the world around you, to do something in you that the comfort of full belonging never could have done. He allowed it to keep you searching, to keep you asking, to keep you from settling into the satisfaction of a life that fit perfectly into the mold of the ordinary, because the ordinary was never what He had in mind for you, and some part of you always knew it. The difference you felt was God's way of keeping a door open in you that the world was constantly trying to close. It was His way of ensuring that the hunger for something more, something real, something that actually answered the deepest questions you were carrying, never got fully satisfied by the substitutes the world was offering. Because a chosen person who is fully satisfied by what the world offers is a chosen person who has stopped searching for what only God can give. And a chosen person who has stopped searching is a chosen person who will never fully find the depth of calling and purpose and intimacy with God that they were marked for before the foundation of the world. The difference kept you searching, and the search led you here. And here is exactly where God intended you to be. Sign 2. You were drawn to God and spiritual things before anyone taught you to be. This one is harder to explain to people who did not experience it, and most of the chosen have given up trying. Because how do you describe to someone who grew up in a home where faith was normal and church-going was routine, the specific quality of a spiritual hunger that preceded instruction, that was present before the Sunday school lessons and the vacation Bible school and the well-meaning relative who sat you down and told you about Jesus? How do you explain the difference between a child who was taught to pray and a child who was already reaching towards something before anyone handed them the language of prayer? How do you articulate the experience of a spiritual awareness that felt native, that felt like it was already in you before anyone put it there, that felt less like something you learned and more like something you remembered. Many of the chosen who carry this sign grew up in homes where faith was not present at all, or was present only in the most nominal, cultural, practically irrelevant sense. And yet from an early age they felt the pull. They felt something that the grown-up world around them was not talking about and did not seem particularly interested in. Something that the church they occasionally attended for Christmas and Easter services seemed to be pointing toward, but never quite reaching. Something that the religious language they heard from a distance seemed to be trying to describe, but somehow kept falling short of. They did not have a name for it. They did not have a framework for it. They just had the pull, steady and persistent, and entirely unexplainable by any of the natural factors in their environment, drawing them toward God before anyone told them he was worth being drawn to. Samuel is the most precise biblical portrait of this sign that Scripture gives us, and the story in 1 Samuel 3 deserves to be read with fresh eyes by every chosen person who felt spiritually aware before they were spiritually instructed. Samuel is a child ministering before the Lord in the temple under Eli the priest, in a time when the word of the Lord was rare and there was no widespread revelation. And yet, in this environment of spiritual scarcity, in this season when even the trained religious leadership is operating at a low level of genuine divine encounter, a child hears a voice. He hears it clearly enough that he mistakes it for the voice of his earthly guardian and runs to him 3 times before Eli, who should have recognized this immediately but did not because his own spiritual attentiveness had been dulled by years of religious routine, finally understands what is happening. Then Eli said to Samuel, "Go, lie down, and it shall be, if he calls you, that you must say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant hears.'" 1 Samuel 3:9. A child hearing the voice of God in an environment where even the adults around him had grown too accustomed to its absence to recognize its arrival. That is the sign. That is what it looks like when God marks a person from childhood with the kind of spiritual awareness that does not wait for institutional permission or adult instruction before it begins to operate. The chosen who carry this sign often describe specific childhood experiences of sensing God's presence in places and moments that had no religious context. In the middle of nature, standing somewhere outside with the sky above them, feeling something so large and so personal simultaneously that the only word that came close to describing it was the word God, even if they did not yet have a theology to attach to it. In moments of crisis or fear, finding themselves speaking to someone they had not been formally introduced to yet, reaching instinctively toward a presence that felt real in a way that the world around them did not always feel real. In dreams that were different from ordinary dreams, that carried a quality of weight and significance and spiritual texture that they have never been able to fully shake even decades later. These experiences were not the product of religious conditioning. They preceded it. They were the evidence of a spirit that was already oriented toward its creator, before the mind had been given the doctrinal framework to process what the spirit was already experiencing. This early spiritual draw also manifested in many of the chosen as a specific and unusual level of seriousness about God that the people around them, including the religious people around them, did not always know how to receive. They asked questions in Sunday school that made the teacher uncomfortable. They read the Bible not because they were required to, but because something in them genuinely wanted to find what was in there. They prayed with a sincerity and an expectancy that was not performance and was not the product of being told to, but that came from a genuine interior sense that prayer was real, that someone was actually on the other side of it, that the conversation was not going into an empty room. They were drawn to worship not as a social experience, but as a genuine reaching towards something their spirit recognized even when their mind did not yet have the language for it. And most of them were made to feel strange for it. The seriousness was too much. The questions were too uncomfortable. The hunger was too intense for the environments they were in, which were often environments that had settled into a comfortable, low-demand version of faith, that had enough of the form to feel religious, but not enough of the fire to feel real. The chosen child who wanted the real thing in an environment built around the form was always going to feel out of place, always going to ask the questions that nobody wanted to answer, always going to press past the surface of what was being offered toward the depth that their spirit already knew was supposed to be there. That pressing, that refusal to be satisfied by the shallow end of religious experience, that insistence on reaching for something more real than what the institution was providing, was not spiritual arrogance in a child. It was spiritual accuracy. It was the evidence of a spirit that had been marked by God with a hunger that the ordinary religious offerings of a comfortable church culture were never going to satisfy, because the one who marked them with the hunger was not interested in satisfying them with anything less than himself. John 6:44 carries the explanation that every chosen person who felt this early, unexplained, environmentally unjustified draw toward God needs to receive with the full personal weight it deserves. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. The draw is the Father's doing. It is not the product of the right upbringing or the right environment or the right religious instruction. It is the sovereign, personal, intentional activity of a Father who decided before you were born that he wanted you, that he was going to draw you, that the pull you felt toward him before anyone taught you to feel it was not random spiritual sensitivity, but the specific gravitational force of a God who had already claimed you as his own and was making sure you felt it from the very beginning of your conscious life. You were not drawn to God because someone told you to be. You were drawn to God because he drew you. And he drew you because he had already decided before the foundation of the world that you were his. Sign 3. You carried a weight of compassion for people's pain that felt too heavy for a child. You were not supposed to feel it that much. That is what everyone around you communicated, even if they never said it in those exact words. The way they looked at you when you cried at something that nobody else in the room seemed particularly moved by. The way they told you to toughen up, to not take things so personally, to stop letting other people's problems become your problems, as though the absorption of other people's pain into your own body was something you were choosing, something you could simply decide to stop doing if you just applied a little more emotional discipline to the situation. But you were not choosing it. It was happening to you. It was arriving in you without your permission and without any apparent regard for your capacity to carry it. And from a very young age you understood, in the wordless way that children understand the things that matter most, that the world contained a level of suffering that most people had found some way to insulate themselves from, and that you had not found that way and could not find it, and were beginning to suspect that maybe you were never going to find it, because maybe the insulation was never part of what God intended for you. You felt other people's pain, not metaphorically, not in the vague, general sense of being a kind and empathetic person who cares about others. You felt it in a way that was almost physical, that landed in your body and your spirit with a weight that was disproportionate to your age and your experience and your ability to process what you were carrying. The child at school who was being bullied, you did not just feel sorry for them. You carried the weight of their humiliation home with you, and it sat on your chest through the night in a way that sleep only partially relieved. The adult in your family who was suffering, whose marriage was falling apart, or whose body was failing, or whose heart was broken in a way they were trying to hide from the children. You felt it even when they thought they had hidden it successfully. You walked into rooms and felt the grief that was being suppressed in them. You sat at dinner tables and felt the tension that everyone else at the table was pretending did not exist. You absorbed atmospheres. You absorbed pain. And nobody around you had any idea what to do with a child who was doing that, because the adults who should have had the framework to interpret it had never been given the framework themselves. What was happening to you was not emotional instability. It was not a psychological weakness that needed to be corrected or a personality flaw that needed to be managed. It was the early manifestation of one of the most essential qualities that the called must carry, which is the capacity to feel what God feels about the suffering of his people. The word the scripture uses for this is compassion, And when you trace the word compassion through the gospel accounts of Jesus' ministry, you discover something that should reframe everything you were ever told about feeling too much. In Matthew 9:36, describing Jesus looking out at the crowds of people who were following him, the text says, "But when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion for them because they were weary and scattered, like sheep having no shepherd." Moved with compassion. The Greek word is splagchnizomai, and it refers to a movement in the deepest internal organs, in the gut, in the visceral center of the person. It is not a polite, managed, emotionally appropriate level of concern for the welfare of others. It is a gut-level, physically felt, impossible to ignore movement of the interior toward the suffering of another person. That is what Jesus felt. That is what drove his ministry. And that is what you were feeling as a child, in the clumsy, uncontained, theologically unframed way of a young person who had not yet been given the language for what was moving in them, but was already being trained by God in the very quality that their calling was going to require. The chosen who carry this sign almost always describe a specific experience of childhood intercession that they did not have a name for at the time. Lying awake at night, carrying the weight of something or someone that their spirit would not release. Speaking to God about it in the wordless, pre-theological way of a child who does not yet know the doctrine of intercession, but whose spirit is already practicing it. Feeling a burden for a person that arrived without explanation and stayed until they prayed it through, even if what they called prayer at that age was simply the urgent, persistent pressing of a child's heart toward a God they were reaching for with everything they had. Feeling sometimes a grief that had no identifiable personal source, that seemed to come from outside themselves and pass through them, that they would later in life recognize as the kind of prophetic intercession that the Spirit generates in those he has chosen to carry the burdens of others as part of their calling. Romans 8:26 describes this in a way that the chosen who experienced it in childhood will recognize immediately. Likewise, the Spirit also helps in our weaknesses. For we do not know what we should pray for as we ought, but the Spirit himself makes intercession for us with groanings which cannot be uttered. Groanings which cannot be uttered. There is a level of intercession that exceeds the capacity of language to contain it, that moves through the chosen person not as articulate prayer, but as a weight, a groaning, a deep interior pressing that the person themselves cannot always explain or locate the source of. The chosen child who lay awake at night carrying a weight they could not name was not experiencing a childhood anxiety disorder. They were experiencing the Spirit making intercession through them before they even knew that was something the Spirit did. They were being used before they understood what it meant to be available for use. And the compassion that felt too heavy for a child to carry was not a burden God put on you without purpose. It was a training. It was the early development of a capacity for intercession, for ministry, for genuine spiritual burden-bearing that your calling was always going to require, being built into you through the very experiences that everyone around you was trying to teach you to feel less deeply. The chosen who carry this sign need to understand that the compassion did not diminish their childhood. It expanded their interior capacity in a way that nothing else could have. Every time you absorbed someone's pain as a child and did not have the tools to process it cleanly, something was being built in you. A depth of empathy that cannot be manufactured in adulthood. A genuine sensitivity to human suffering that is not performance and not the result of reading the right books or attending the right conferences, but is the product of a childhood that was spent feeling the world more deeply than the world knew how to receive. That depth is not your wound, it is your weapon. And the calling that God has been building toward your entire life is going to need every ounce of the compassion that felt too heavy for a child, because the people you are being sent to are carrying weights that require someone who knows what weight actually feels like from the inside. Sign 4. You were marked by unusual suffering, loss, or hardship early in life. This is the sign that the chosen resist most, not because they doubt that the suffering was real, The suffering was real, and it was significant, and in many cases it was the kind of suffering that should never happen to a child. And the fact that it did is not something that gets explained away by theology or softened by the passage of time into something that no longer carries weight. The resistance is not to the reality of the suffering. The resistance is to the idea that God was in it, that his hand was present in the middle of the hardest things of their childhood, that the losses and the wounds and the hardships that marked them from an early age were not simply the tragic byproducts of a broken world, but were somehow woven into the fabric of a sovereign plan that was always, even in its darkest moments, oriented toward something redemptive. That idea is hard to receive. It is supposed to be hard to receive. And this teaching is not going to pretend that receiving it is simple or that the tension it creates is not real. But it is going to say this: the pattern of early suffering in the lives of the chosen is not accidental. It is not random. And it is not the evidence of a God who was absent from the formative years of the people he called. It is one of the most consistent patterns in the entire biblical narrative of God's dealings with the people he chose for significant kingdom purpose. And the chosen, who have not yet been given the framework to see their own early suffering through this lens, are carrying wounds that have no context and pain that has no meaning. And meaningless pain is one of the heaviest things a human being can carry, because there is nothing to do with it, nowhere to put it, no way to integrate it into the story of a life that is moving somewhere purposeful. Joseph. Spend a moment with Joseph, because his story is the most complete and most devastating portrait in Scripture of what the early suffering of the chosen actually looks like from the inside, and what it produces when God is finished with it. By the time Joseph is 17 years old, he has already experienced the death of his mother, the favoritism of his father that isolated him from his brothers, the murderous hatred of the siblings who were supposed to be his protection and his community, the pit they threw him into with the intention of leaving him there to die, the slave traders they sold him to for 20 pieces of silver, and the foreign land he arrived in, stripped of everything that had previously defined his identity and his belonging. He is a teenager. He is alone. He is in a country whose language he does not speak, whose culture is entirely foreign to him, in the household of a man who owns him and can do with him whatever he chooses. By every natural measure, the life of Joseph has been a catastrophe. By every natural measure, the God who was supposed to have called him, who was supposed to have given him those dreams about ruling and authority and his family bowing before him, appears to have been spectacularly absent from the most formative and most devastating years of his young life. But Genesis 39:2 inserts a sentence into the middle of this catastrophe that changes everything. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. The Lord was with Joseph, not watching from a distance, not planning to show up once the suffering had run its course. With Joseph, in the pit, on the slave trader's caravan, in Potiphar's house, in the prison that came after the false accusation, in every single layer of the suffering that was shaping, in ways that Joseph could not yet see and would not fully understand until the moment he stood before Pharaoh with an interpretation and a strategy that saved a nation, the exact person that the calling required him to be. The suffering was not a detour from the purpose, it was the path to it. And the God who was with Joseph in every moment of it was not a passive observer of a situation that had gotten out of hand. He was the sovereign architect of a preparation that the comfort of an unchanged, unsuffered, unbroken life could never have produced. What God was building in Joseph through the suffering was specific. He was building a humility that the favoritism of his father's house would have destroyed if the suffering had not dismantled it. He was building a dependence on God that prosperity would have eroded. He was building a capacity for forgiveness that only a person who has been genuinely, deeply, personally wronged can develop, and that the calling Joseph was moving toward was going to require in a moment of confrontation with the very brothers who had sold him that would either produce bitterness or breakthrough. He was building a wisdom in the darkness that the brightness of an unchallenged life never generates, the specific, seasoned, tested wisdom of a person who has been in the pit and in the prison and has found God faithful in both places and therefore knows, with a certainty that cannot be shaken by circumstance, that God is who he says he is and does what he says he will do. That wisdom is not available any other way. You cannot get it from a book. You cannot get it from a sermon. You can only get it from having been in the places that required it of you before you knew you were being prepared to carry it. Romans 8:28 is one of those verses that the chosen have heard so many times that its full weight has sometimes been blunted by familiarity. And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. All things. The translation does not say most things, does not say the things that seem spiritual enough to be included in the category of what God redeems, does not say the things that happened after you were old enough to make sense of them. All things. The loss you experienced as a child that nobody around you had the grace or the wisdom to help you process. The hardship that shaped your earliest understanding of what the world was and whether it was safe. The wound that came from a place that should have been protection and was not. The suffering that left a mark so deep that you can still feel it decades later when something in the present moment brushes up against it unexpectedly. All of it, every single piece of it, working together, not individually redemptive, not each piece carrying its own isolated meaning, but together in the sovereign hands of a God who sees the whole of a life from beginning to end and is working every piece, including the pieces that feel most broken and most senseless, toward a good that is bigger than any individual piece can reveal on its own. The chosen who are marked by early suffering carry something in them that the chosen who are not do not carry in the same way, and that something is the specific, hard-won, genuinely earned authority to speak into the suffering of others from a place of real knowing rather than theoretical sympathy. When the chosen person who lost a parent in childhood stands before someone who has just experienced loss, they are not speaking from a textbook. When the chosen person who grew up in hardship looks into the eyes of someone who is in the middle of their own hardship, they are not offering managed compassion from a comfortable distance. They are speaking from the inside of an experience that shaped them, that broke them in the places that needed breaking, that built them in the places that needed building, that gave them an authority in the specific territory of human suffering that cannot be conferred by education or ordination or any other human institution. It can only be given by God through the furnace of early suffering that he allowed and was present in and was working through the entire time, even when his presence was the last thing it felt like. Isaiah 61:3 is the promise that the chosen who were marked by early suffering need to receive as personally as it was always intended. To console those who mourn in Zion, to give them beauty for ashes, the oil of joy for mourning, the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness, that they may be called trees of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that he may be glorified. Beauty for ashes. The exchange is real. The ashes of your childhood, the losses and the wounds and the hardships that left their mark on the person you became, are not the final word over your story. They are the raw material of a beauty that only God can produce from that specific kind of brokenness. A beauty that is not the absence of the scar, but the redemption of it. The transformation of the wound into the very thing that makes you most useful, most credible, most genuinely equipped for the calling that God was building toward through every hard and broken and seemingly God-absent moment of your early life. He was never absent. He was always working. And what he was working toward is still being revealed. Sign 5. You had dreams, visions, or an awareness of the spiritual realm that others did not share. There were things you saw and felt and experienced in the night, and sometimes in the full light of day, that you learned very early not to talk about. Not because you were not certain they were real. You were certain. The certainty was one of the most disorienting parts of the whole experience, because you could not reconcile the absolute interior knowing that what you had seen or felt or been shown was genuinely real, with the complete absence of any framework in the world around you to receive it. You tried once or twice to describe what you had experienced to someone you trusted, a parent, a sibling, a friend, maybe a Sunday school teacher who seemed like they might have the spiritual vocabulary for it. And the response you received, whether it was gentle dismissal or outright skepticism, or the particularly painful kind of concern that suggested that what you had experienced was something to be worried about, rather than something to be received, taught you a lesson you carried for years. Keep it to yourself. The things you see and feel and know in the spiritual realm are not for sharing. They are not safe to share. The world does not have the container for them, and the people in it will not thank you for trying to pour them out. And so you carried them alone. The dreams that were different from ordinary dreams in a way that you could feel before you were fully awake. That carried a weight and a texture and a clarity that the ordinary dreams of sleep did not carry. That sometimes showed you things that had not yet happened and then happened. That sometimes brought you into places and conversations that felt more real than the waking world, rather than less. The moments of spiritual awareness in ordinary places, the sense of a presence in a room that the room's other occupants did not seem to notice, the knowing of something about a person or a situation that you had no natural way of knowing and could not explain without sounding like something was wrong with you. The visions, whether in the night or in the quiet moments of the day, that showed you things in the language of symbol and image and spiritual impression that your young mind did not yet have the theological framework to interpret, but that your spirit received with a recognition that bypassed the need for interpretation entirely. What you were experiencing was not the product of an overactive imagination. It was not the symptom of a psychological condition that needed diagnosis and management. It was the early operation of spiritual gifts in a person who had been called and marked by God before they were old enough to understand what calling and marking meant. Gifts that were operating in the raw, unschooled, theologically uncontained way of something that is genuinely present but has not yet been given the framework and the discipleship and the spiritual community it needs to develop properly. Joel 2:28 is the promise that God speaks through the prophet, and that Peter stands up on the day of Pentecost and declares is being fulfilled in real time. And it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your old men shall dream dreams, your young men shall see visions, your sons and your daughters, your young men. The outpouring of the Spirit and the spiritual experiences that accompany it are not reserved for the theologically trained or the spiritually mature or the adults who have been in the faith long enough to be trusted with the supernatural. They fall on the young. They fall on the children. They fall on the ones who have not yet been given the language for what they are receiving, and the absence of the language does not make the experience less real. It just makes it harder to carry without the community that should have been there to help interpret it. The biblical portrait of a chosen person experiencing spiritual awareness and prophetic dreams from childhood is not limited to a single example. It is a pattern. Samuel heard the voice of God as a child in a season when even the adult religious leadership around him had grown spiritually dull. Daniel, taken captive as a young man into a foreign culture that had no framework for the God of Israel, was given the ability to understand visions and dreams of all kinds as recorded in Daniel 1:17, a gift that operated not because he had completed the right theological training, but because God had placed it in him, and the suffering of the exile had created the conditions in which it could emerge. Joseph received his prophetic dreams at 17, before he had any of the life experience that might have given him a framework for what he was being shown. And the dreams were so clear and so specific that even his family, who dismissed them with irritation and jealousy, remembered them years later when the reality of what Joseph had been shown began to unfold around them. The pattern is consistent. God gives the spiritual awareness early. He gives it before the person has the maturity to fully process it, before the community around them has the capacity to properly receive it, before the theological framework exists in their life to provide context for it. He gives it early because it is part of the marking, part of the preparation, part of the equipping of a person whose calling will require them to operate in spiritual dimensions that the naturally minded world around them will never fully access or understand. The chosen who carry this sign often describe a specific and persistent experience of knowing things about situations and people that they had no natural way of knowing, and the experience of that knowing arriving not as an audible voice or a dramatic vision, but as a quiet, settled, absolute interior certainty that was simply present without announcement and without explanation. They knew the phone was going to ring before it rang. They knew something was wrong with someone they loved before any natural evidence of it was available. They walked into situations with a foreknowledge that they could not source and could not justify, but that consistently proved accurate. And the consistency of its accuracy was itself one of the most unsettling aspects of the experience, because it kept confirming that what was happening to them was real, while simultaneously ensuring that they had no way to talk about it that would not make them sound unstable. This sign left many of the chosen in a particular kind of spiritual isolation that was different from the isolation produced by simply feeling different or not belonging. It was the isolation of carrying genuine spiritual experience with no one to bring it to, no elder to interpret it, no community to say, yes, what you are experiencing is real. It has a name. It has a biblical precedent. It is the Spirit of God operating in you, and here is how to steward it. The chosen child with prophetic dreams and spiritual awareness who grows up without that community learns to hide the gift rather than develop it, learns to suppress the impressions rather than submit them to the kind of spiritual accountability and discipleship that would have helped them grow into what God intended. And the gift that was supposed to be developed from childhood arrives in adulthood still raw, still somewhat unsettling to its carrier, still surrounded by the old shame and the old confusion that the years of carrying it alone and in silence produced. But the gift is still there. That is what matters. The years of suppression did not kill it. The lack of community did not extinguish it. The dismissal and the skepticism and the theological environments that had no room for it did not remove what God placed. It is still in you. It has been in you since childhood. And the fact that it has survived everything that should have buried it is itself a testimony to the tenacity of the God who placed it, who does not give gifts he intends to take back, who does not mark a life with spiritual awareness and then change his mind about the purpose that awareness was meant to serve. Romans 11:29 settles this with a finality that every chosen person who carries this sign needs to receive into the deepest part of their understanding. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable, not conditional on your perfect stewardship of them in childhood, not dependent on your having had the right community around you to develop them properly, not cancelled by the years of suppression or the seasons of doubt or the theological environments that told you the gift was not real or was not for today or was not something a person like you should be operating in. Irrevocable. What God placed in you before you had the language for it is still placed in you. And this season of your life is the season in which he intends to bring it fully out of hiding. Sign 6. You were misunderstood, rejected, or isolated in ways that felt deeply personal. It was not just that you did not fit. It was the specific quality of the not fitting, the particular texture of the rejection, the way the isolation landed on you not as something random or impersonal, but as something that seemed to go directly to the core of who you were, as though what was being rejected was not a behavior or a choice or a social mistake you had made, but the actual essential you, the self that existed underneath all of the adjustments and the accommodations and the desperate attempts to be what the people around you seemed to need you to be. You were not rejected for what you did, you were rejected for what you were, and what you were was the very thing God had made you to be, which meant that the rejection, as personal and as painful as it felt, was in a dimension that you could not yet access in childhood, the most accurate confirmation available that the marking was real. The chosen almost universally carry this sign, and they carry it with a consistency that cannot be explained by coincidence or personality type or simple social misfortune. There is a targeting quality to the rejection experienced by the chosen in childhood and adolescence that goes beyond the ordinary social difficulties of growing up. It is too specific. It is too persistent. It follows them across different environments, different schools, different social groups, different attempts to find the place of belonging that every human heart is designed to need. They leave one situation where they did not fit and enter another one, carrying the hope that this time will be different, and find with a consistency that is eventually impossible to ignore that the not fitting follows them, that the isolation is somehow portable, that the rejection has a way of finding them regardless of where they go or how hard they try to make themselves acceptable to the world that keeps not quite receiving them. This is not accidental. The enemy understood something about you before you understood it yourself, and what he understood sent him after your sense of belonging, your sense of being wanted and received and valued, from the very earliest years of your life. Because a chosen person who is secure in their identity, who knows who they are and whose they are and what they carry, is an extraordinarily dangerous thing in the kingdom of darkness. And a chosen person who has been so thoroughly rejected and isolated in the years before they developed the spiritual framework to understand what was happening to them, that they carry a deep, chronic, bone-level uncertainty about their own worth and their own belonging and their own right to take up space in the world, that person is significantly easier to keep neutralized, significantly easier to keep small, significantly easier to prevent from stepping into the fullness of the calling that God prepared for them before the foundation of the world. The rejection was an assignment, not an accident, not the random cruelty of a broken social world that sometimes damages the people who move through it. A deliberate, targeted, strategically deployed assignment of the enemy against the specific area of a chosen person's life that he needed to wound most deeply in order to prevent the calling from fully emerging. He went after belonging because he knew that a person who does not believe they belong anywhere will spend their entire life trying to earn the right to take up space rather than boldly occupying the territory God assigned to them. He went after identity because he knew that a person who does not know who they are is a person who cannot walk in the authority of what they carry. He went after the social world of the chosen child, not because he was merely cruel, though he is, but because he was strategic. He saw what was coming. He saw what God had marked in that child, and he moved early to wound the very foundations that the calling was going to require to be strong. Jesus was not exempt from this sign. That needs to be said clearly and without qualification, because the chosen who carry the wound of rejection need to know that the one they follow carried it too, and carried it in ways that went to the deepest possible level of human experience. Isaiah 53:3 describes the Messiah with words that every rejected chosen person needs to sit inside. He is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised and we did not esteem him. Despised, rejected, not esteemed. The Son of God, the Word made flesh, the one in whom dwelt all the fullness of the Godhead bodily, was not received by the world he came to save. He was rejected by the religious establishment that should have recognized him. He was abandoned by the disciples who had walked closest to him. He was crucified by the people he came to redeem. And the rejection was not incidental to the mission. It was, in the most profound and most costly sense, the very path through which the mission was accomplished. The rejected one became the Redeemer. The despised one became the cornerstone. The one whom the builders refused became, as Psalm 118:22 declares, the chief cornerstone. Rejection in the hands of God is never the final word. It is always the preparation for something that the world, in its rejection, could never have anticipated. The chosen who were rejected in childhood are being prepared for a ministry of reception. This is one of the most beautiful and most precise ironies of God's economy. The people who are most rejected in their early years are often the ones whom God positions in adulthood to be the most genuine, most grace-filled, most personally costly receivers of the people that the world is still rejecting. They know what it feels like to not be wanted. They know the specific weight of the isolation that follows a person who does not fit anywhere. They know the particular kind of hunger that a person carries when they have spent years looking for a place to belong and have not found it. And because they know it from the inside, because the knowledge is not theoretical but experiential and bone deep and written into the earliest chapters of their story, they are equipped to offer something to the rejected people they are sent to that the people who were never rejected cannot offer in the same way. They are equipped to offer genuine, knowing, costly, personally authenticated welcome. The welcome of someone who knows exactly what it costs the person in front of them to walk through the door. That is not a small thing in the kingdom of God. It is, in fact, one of the most powerful ministries available to a human being, and it was forged in the rejection of your childhood. Psalm 27:10 is the verse that the chosen who carry the wound of childhood rejection need to carry into the rest of this teaching and into the rest of their lives. When my father and my mother forsake me, then the Lord will take care of me. The rejection of the people who were supposed to receive you did not leave you without a receiver. It left you with the only receiver who matters ultimately. The one whose reception of you is not conditional on your performance or your fitting or your ability to make yourself acceptable to a world that was never going to fully receive what God placed in you anyway. He received you. He has always received you. And the called person who has settled into the absolute security of being fully received by God is a person who no longer needs the world's reception to move forward in their calling. They are free. Free to be exactly what God made them to be, in exactly the way He made them to be it, without the crippling need for the approval and the belonging that the rejection of their childhood was designed to make them spend their entire lives chasing. The rejection that was meant to keep you small has become, in God's hands, the very thing that set you free. Sign 7. There was always something in you that knew you were made for more. Not arrogance. Get that out of the way first, because it needs to be cleared before anything else can be received. Because the chosen who carry this sign have spent years, some of them decades, being made to feel that the knowing was arrogance, that the sense of something larger pulling at them from the inside was pride dressed up in spiritual language, that a person of genuine humility would be content with the ordinary rather than perpetually restless in the face of it. They swallowed that accusation and tried to make peace with it, and sometimes even agreed with it, telling themselves that the restlessness was a character flaw they needed to surrender rather than a divine signal they needed to follow. And the agreement with that lie cost them. It cost them years in some cases, years of trying to be satisfied with a life that was not the life God had written over them. Years of performing contentment they did not feel in order to avoid the judgment of people who had confused holy restlessness with worldly ambition and had never been given the framework to tell the difference. But the knowing was never arrogance. It was never the ego of a person who believed they were better than the people around them, or more deserving of a significant life, or entitled to something the world owed them. It was something categorically different from all of those things. It was a signal, a consistent, persistent, impossible to permanently silence signal from the deepest part of a person's spirit that the life in front of them, as decent and as manageable and as socially acceptable as it might have been, was not the life that was waiting for them. That there was something else, something larger, something that had their name on it in a way that the ordinary life did not, and that the ordinary life, for all its genuine blessings, was not able to fully satisfy because they were not fully made for it. They were made for the something else. And the knowing of that, the deep interior certainty of it that arrived before they had any idea what the something else actually was not their own ambition speaking. It was God's intention announcing itself from the inside before the outside had caught up with it. Ecclesiastes 3:11 names what you are experiencing with a precision that should make something settle in you the moment you receive it. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. Eternity in the human heart. Not in some hearts, not in the hearts of the particularly spiritual or the exceptionally gifted, in the human heart. God placed something in the interior of every person he made that is oriented towards something larger than the temporary, something that cannot be fully satisfied by anything the finite world offers, because it was designed for something the finite world cannot contain. But in the chosen, in the people he marked from before birth for a specific kingdom purpose, that eternity in the heart carries an additional dimension. It carries not only the general human orientation towards something beyond the temporal, but a specific, personal, calling-shaped pull toward the particular something that God prepared for them before the foundation of the world. The restlessness you felt was not a generic spiritual hunger. It was a specific pull toward a specific purpose. And the fact that you could feel it before you could name it is one of the clearest signs that what was pulling you was not your own ambition, but God's intention. The chosen who carry this sign describe the knowing in different ways, depending on their personality and their history and the language available to them in the environments they grew up in. Some describe it as a sense of destiny, a word that makes some people uncomfortable because it has been misused in so many motivational contexts that it has lost some of its genuine spiritual weight. But that is the right word for what they felt. Not destiny in the sense of an inevitable trajectory that requires no cooperation or surrender or costly alignment with God's purposes, but destiny in the biblical sense of a purpose established before birth, that the person was created to walk into through the daily, ordinary, sometimes costly choices of a life lived in obedience to the one who established it. Others describe it as a voice, not audible, not dramatic, but present and consistent. A quiet interior insistence that there was something they were supposed to do, and somewhere they were supposed to go, and something they were supposed to carry that the life they were living had not yet fully accessed. Others describe it simply as a dissatisfaction, a persistent inability to be fully at rest in the ordinary, not because they were ungrateful for what they had, but because something in them kept pressing toward what they did not yet have, what they could not yet see, but could feel in the way you feel the warmth of a fire before you have turned the corner to see the flame. Paul describes his own version of this knowing in Philippians 3:13-14 with a language that is less about confident destiny and more about the specific quality of forward movement that the sense of a calling produces in a person. Brethren, I do not count myself to have apprehended, but one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind and reaching forward to those things which are ahead, I press toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. Reaching forward, pressing toward. These are not the postures of a person who is fully satisfied with where they are. They are the postures of a person who can feel something ahead of them that they have not yet reached, who is oriented toward it with the full force of their energy and their surrender, who cannot settle into the comfort of the present position because the forward pull of the calling is more powerful than the backward pull of the familiar. That is what you have been feeling your entire life, that pressing, that reaching, that inability to fully arrive in any of the stopping places the world offered you, because something in you always knew that the stopping place was not the destination. The knowing also expressed itself in childhood as a specific relationship with the future that was different from ordinary childhood dreaming. Every child dreams about the future in some form, but the chosen who carry this sign describe something in their relationship with the future that had a different quality from daydreaming or wishful thinking. They did not merely want a certain kind of future, they felt the weight of one. They felt the responsibility of something that was coming toward them through time, something that was going to require something of them that they did not yet possess, but were going to need to develop, something that was large enough to be simultaneously exciting and terrifying, and that produced in them, even as children, a seriousness about their life and their choices and their development that the people around them often interpreted as either admirable maturity or unsettling intensity, depending on their own framework. The chosen child who is carrying the weight of a calling they cannot yet name is not a child who moves through their days lightly. They are a child who already knows, in the wordless, pre-theological way of someone whose spirit is ahead of their theology, that their life is not their own, and that something is coming that will require everything they have and then some. Moses is the biblical portrait of this sign in its most extreme and most instructive form. Acts 7:23-25 gives us a glimpse into Moses' interior life that the Exodus account does not provide in the same way, and it is a glimpse that reveals the knowing operating in him before any of the events of his calling had fully unfolded. Now, when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended and avenged him who was oppressed, and struck down the Egyptian. For he supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand, but they did not understand. He supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand. Moses, at 40 years old, before the burning bush, before the plagues, before the Exodus, before any of the events through which God's calling on his life became publicly visible and undeniable, already carried an interior knowing that the deliverance of his people was somehow connected to him. He did not have the full picture. He did not have the divine commission or the supernatural empowering or the confirmed word from God that would come decades later in the desert. He had the knowing, the deep, interior, impossible to silence knowing that something about his life and the suffering of his people were connected in a way that was going to matter, and he acted on it prematurely and disastrously, which is what happens when the knowing gets ahead of the preparation. But the knowing itself was not wrong. It was not arrogance. It was accurate. Moses was going to deliver his people. God had decided that before Moses was born. The knowing in Moses' heart was the echo of a decision made in heaven about a calling that was always coming, always real, and always going to require exactly the person that 40 years of palace life and another 40 years of desert humility were together producing. The premature acting on the knowing is itself a sign that deserves a moment of attention, because many of the chosen have their own version of the Moses moment, the point at which the sense of calling produced an action that was ahead of the preparation, that was driven by the right instinct but the wrong timing, that ended in a kind of failure or setback or exile that the chosen person has been carrying as evidence that the knowing was wrong, rather than recognizing it as evidence that the knowing was right, but the season was not yet. If you have a Moses moment in your history, if there is a time when you moved toward what you felt called to, and it collapsed in a way that left you in your own version of the desert, wondering whether the knowing was ever real or whether you had simply deceived yourself, this teaching is saying to you directly that the desert is not the disqualification of the calling. It is the preparation for it. Moses spent 40 years in the desert being stripped of everything the palace had built in him that the calling did not need, and being given in the silence and the obscurity and the smallness of the shepherd's life everything that the palace never could have given him. The knowing survived the desert. It was still there at 80 years old when the bush caught fire and God spoke. It was still there because what God places in a person he does not remove, and the calling that the knowing was pointing toward was not cancelled by the failure of the premature attempt to walk in it. It was simply being prepared more carefully than Moses had originally anticipated. Your knowing is still there too. Under the years of trying to suppress it, under the weight of the rejection and the misunderstanding and the voices that called it arrogance and pride, under the desert seasons that followed the premature attempts to walk in it, under the discouragement of a calling that has taken longer to emerge than you expected and has cost more than you were initially told it would cost, the knowing is still there, still pressing, still reaching forward, still oriented towards something that the ordinary life was never going to fully contain. And the fact that it is still there, after everything that has tried to silence it, is one of the most powerful testimonies available to the reality that what you have been carrying since childhood is not self-generated ambition that will eventually burn itself out. It is the voice of God, speaking from before your birth into the deepest chamber of your spirit, saying that you were made for something specific, something significant, something that is still coming, something that all of the preparation and the suffering and the desert and the waiting has been building toward. It is still coming, and you are closer to it than the length of the wait has made it feel. Receiving these 7 signs as genuine markers of God's hand on your life is not a simple or a painless exercise. It is not a matter of hearing the list and nodding along and feeling encouraged in a general way, and then moving through the rest of the teaching without anything in you being genuinely disturbed or genuinely moved or genuinely broken open in the way that real recognition always breaks something open. Because receiving these signs as true means receiving something about your childhood that you may have been interpreting an entirely different way for a very long time. It means looking back at the experiences that hurt you most, the isolation, the rejection, the suffering, the spiritual loneliness of carrying things you could not share, the knowing that nobody around you could fully receive, and beginning to see the hand of God in them in a way that does not erase the pain, but does finally give it a context large enough to hold it. And that reframing is not painless. It is not neat. It does not resolve every question or remove every wound, but it does something that nothing else can do, which is give the chosen person a story they can live in rather than a wound they are merely surviving. And a chosen person with a story they can live in is a chosen person who is finally free to move toward everything that the knowing has been pointing toward their entire life. There is a question that the 7 signs inevitably raise in the heart of the chosen person who has just recognized themselves in them. And it is a question that deserves a full and honest answer before this teaching moves any further. The question is not whether the signs are real. By this point in the teaching, the chosen who have been tracking with everything that has been said have felt enough recognition in their own spirit to know that the signs are real, and that the recognition itself is the spirit bearing witness to something that was always true. The question is deeper than that. It is the question of why. Why does God mark his chosen from childhood and not from conversion? Why does the calling precede the consciousness of it by so many years in the lives of so many of the chosen? Why does God begin something in a child that the child has no framework to understand, no community to help them carry, no theological language to give shape to, and no way to interpret without either dismissing it or being dismissed for it? Why not wait? Why not begin the marking at a point in the person's life when they are old enough to receive it clearly, spiritually mature enough to steward it properly, surrounded by the kind of community that can help them develop what God is placing in them, rather than leaving them to carry it alone in the bewildering silence of a childhood that felt different from the very beginning? The answer begins in the nature of God himself, and in the specific way he has always worked in the lives of the people he calls to carry something significant for the kingdom. God does not work backward from a person's readiness. He works forward from his own intention. He does not wait for a person to arrive at the level of spiritual maturity that would make the calling feel appropriate before he begins to establish it. He establishes it first, from before the foundation of the world, and then he spends the entirety of that person's life, including every season they were not yet aware of the calling, and every season they were too broken to walk in it, and every season they were actively running from it, building them toward the fullness of what he decided before they existed. The calling is not responsive to the person. The person is being shaped to be responsive to the calling. And that shaping, when God does it properly, does not begin at conversion, or at the moment of the first prophetic word, or at the laying on of hands in a church service. It begins in the womb. It begins in the first experiences of a life that is already being formed for a purpose that God has already fully decided. Galatians 1:15-16 gives us Paul's own testimony about the timing of God's calling in his life, with a precision that should permanently dismantle the idea that the calling begins at conversion. But when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me through his grace to reveal his Son in me, that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately confer with flesh and blood, separated from his mother's womb. Paul is not describing a calling that began on the road to Damascus when the light blinded him and the voice of Jesus stopped him in his tracks, and everything he had been building his life around collapsed in an instant. He is describing a calling that was established in the womb, that was always there, that God pleased himself to reveal at a specific moment in time, but that had been in operation long before that moment of revelation arrived. The Damascus Road was the revelation of a calling that the womb had already established. The conversion was not the beginning of the story. It was the moment the story became visible. And everything that came before it, including the years of religious persecution that Paul spent violently opposing the very gospel he was called to preach, was not outside the calling. It was inside it. It was the specific, painful, ultimately essential formation of a person who needed to know from the inside what the law without grace produces before he could spend his life proclaiming what grace without the law releases. This is why God marks his chosen from childhood rather than from conversion. Because the formation that the calling requires cannot be compressed into the years of a person's conscious Christian life. It requires the whole of the life. It requires the childhood experiences that shape the deepest interior architecture of a person before the conscious mind is fully in control of the process. It requires the early suffering that produces the specific kind of humility and dependence and compassion that adult suffering, for all its genuine formative power, cannot produce in the same way, because adult suffering lands on a self that is already formed and must be broken down before it can be rebuilt, while childhood suffering lands on a self that is still being formed and shapes the very foundations rather than having to dismantle them first. It requires the years of feeling different and not belonging and carrying things alone and reaching toward God before anyone handed them the language of prayer, because those years are not merely the difficult prelude to the real story. They are the real story. They are the chapters in which the most essential and the most irreplaceable formation is happening, in which God is building into the foundations of a person's character and capacity and interior life everything that the surface level of adult spiritual development could never produce on its own. The chosen also need to understand that God marks them from childhood because the enemy's opposition to the calling requires it. This is a dimension of the answer that is rarely named with sufficient directness, but it is real, and it matters enormously to the chosen who are trying to make sense of why the warfare against their life has felt so early, so personal, and so targeted. If the calling is established in the womb, so is the opposition to it. The enemy does not wait to see what a person becomes before he decides whether their calling is worth opposing. He reads the marking. He sees what God has placed in a person before that person has any awareness of it themselves. And he begins his assignment against the calling at the same time God begins his preparation for it, which is to say, from the very beginning of the person's life. This is why the childhood of the chosen is so often marked not only by the signs of God's hand, but also by the signs of the enemy's opposition, the unusual suffering, the targeted rejection, the isolation, the attempts to wound the very foundations that the calling was going to require to be strong. The warfare was early because the calling was early. The targeting was personal because the marking was personal. And the chosen who understand this stop interpreting the difficulty of their childhood as evidence of God's absence and start receiving it as evidence of the enemy's awareness of something about them that they themselves did not yet know. Herod's massacre of the children in Bethlehem following the birth of Jesus is the most extreme and most terrible illustration of this principle in Scripture, and it is an illustration that the chosen need to sit with in its full horror before they can receive the truth it contains. Matthew 2:16 records that when Herod realized he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under. An entire generation of children slaughtered because one child had been marked by God for a purpose that the kingdom of darkness could not afford to allow to reach its fulfillment. The massacre was the enemy's response to a marking he could not ignore and could not wait to address. He moved against the child because he understood, with a clarity that the child's own parents were still processing, what the child carried and what it was going to cost him if that carrying was allowed to fully emerge. The chosen are not Jesus. The parallel is not perfect, but the principle it illustrates is real, and it applies to every life that God marks for significant kingdom purpose. The enemy moves early. He moves against the childhood because the childhood is where the foundation is laid, and a foundation successfully wounded in childhood is a foundation that will cost the person the rest of their adult life to repair. He knew what was in you before you knew it, and he moved against it early for exactly that reason. But what the enemy did not account for, in Bethlehem or in your childhood, is the same thing he never fully accounts for, which is the faithfulness of a God who does not mark a life for a purpose and then leave it unprotected in the years before that purpose is fully revealed. Jesus was hidden in Egypt while Herod raged. The marking was protected by a divine concealment that the enemy's fury could not penetrate, and the chosen who were targeted in childhood were also hidden in ways they may not have recognized as hiddenness at the time. The isolation that felt like abandonment was sometimes the hiddenness of a God who was protecting what he had placed in them from exposure before it was ready to be revealed. The difference that kept them from fully belonging to the environments around them was sometimes the grace of a God who knew that full belonging to those environments would have cost them the very thing he was building in them. The suffering that felt like evidence of his distance was sometimes the specific and costly formation of a person whose calling required a depth of character that comfort alone could never have produced. He was hiding them. He was protecting them. He was holding what he placed in them through every season that tried to take it, and what he held, he is now ready to reveal. What the enemy understood about the chosen before they understood it themselves is that the called life, fully expressed, is one of the most dangerous things in the kingdom of darkness. A chosen person walking in the full awareness of their calling, equipped with everything that the formation of their entire life has built into them, operating in the gifts that have been in them since childhood, carrying the compassion that was forged in early suffering, and the authority that was developed in rejection, and the spiritual sensitivity that survived years of being misunderstood, and the knowing that refused to be silenced by decades of people telling them it was arrogance. That person is a weapon in the hands of God that the enemy has no effective answer for. Because everything he threw at them in their childhood, every assignment he deployed against their foundations, every wound he inflicted against their sense of worth and belonging and identity, God took and turned into exactly the material he needed to build the very thing the enemy was trying to prevent. The wounds became weapons. The rejection became authority. The isolation became the kind of deep interior knowing that only the person who has spent years carrying things alone can develop. The suffering became the specific credibility and the specific compassion that the ministry requires. And the knowing that the enemy spent decades trying to convince the chosen was arrogance became the settled, unshakable, enemy-defying certainty of a person who finally understands that what they felt from the very beginning was not the voice of their own ambition. It was the voice of God, speaking the truth about them before they had the ears to fully hear it. And now they have the ears. And now the truth can be received. And what is received with that kind of recognition, in the spirit of a chosen person who finally understands their own story, is the kind of foundation on which everything God always intended can finally and fully be built. There is a statement that needs to be made before anything else in this section. A statement that is simple enough to say in a single sentence, but deep enough to spend the rest of a lifetime unpacking. And it is this: the wounds of your childhood are not the interruption of your calling. They are the material of it. Not the unfortunate collateral damage of a fallen world that God is graciously working around in order to still accomplish something meaningful through a life that was damaged before it had the chance to fully form. The actual material. The specific, irreplaceable, sovereignly permitted raw substance from which God is constructing the very weapons that your calling requires. Weapons that could not have been forged any other way, in any other fire, from any other substance, because the depth of what is being built requires the depth of what was broken. And the depth of what was broken in the childhood of the chosen is, in the economy of a God who wastes nothing, the precise measure of the depth of what he intends to build. This is not easy to receive. It needs to be said that way plainly and without the kind of smooth theological packaging that makes hard truths easier to swallow but less genuinely transformative when they land. Because receiving this truth, really receiving it, not as a comforting idea that softens the memory of the pain, but as a living reality that fundamentally reframes the entire story of your childhood and what it was for, requires the chosen to do something that is genuinely costly. It requires them to look directly at the thing that hurt them most, the specific wound that left the deepest mark, the experience that they have spent years either trying to process or trying to avoid processing, and to hold it in one hand while holding in the other hand the reality of a God whose sovereignty is not limited by the brokenness of the world he operates in, and whose redemptive purposes are not thwarted by the damage that the enemy inflicts in the early years of the lives he has marked. To hold both of those things simultaneously without collapsing either one of them, without minimizing the wound to make the theology easier, or abandoning the theology to make the wound feel more validatable, is one of the most demanding spiritual exercises the chosen will ever be asked to perform. But it is also one of the most liberating, because the chosen person who can hold both of those things at the same time is a chosen person who is no longer a victim of their own story. They are the inheritor of it. Joseph understood this. And the moment in Scripture where his understanding becomes fully visible is one of the most emotionally devastating and most theologically precise moments in the entire biblical narrative. Genesis 50:19-20, the scene after their father Jacob has died, and Joseph's brothers are terrified that he will now take revenge for everything they did to him. But Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, you meant evil against me. But God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Two intentions operating simultaneously in the same set of events. The brothers' intention was evil. Joseph is not revising history or softening what was done to him in order to arrive at a more spiritually tidy conclusion. He is acknowledging the full reality of the evil while simultaneously holding the equally full reality of a God whose intention in the same events was good, was purposeful, was oriented from the very beginning towards something that the evil could not prevent, and in fact, in the most stunning reversal possible, was actually being used to accomplish. The pit was evil, the slavery was evil, the false accusation was evil, the prison was evil, and God meant all of it for good. Not in spite of the evil, but through it, with it, by means of it, in the specific and sovereign way of a God who is so completely in control of the story that he can allow the enemy his worst and still arrive at the destination he decided before the enemy made his first move. The wounds of your childhood are real. The people who inflicted them may have meant evil. The circumstances that produced them were broken and fallen and sometimes genuinely unjust, in ways that deserve to be named clearly, rather than glossed over in the rush to get to the redemptive conclusion. But God meant it for good. Every wound that the enemy designed to disqualify you, God was using to qualify you. Every experience of suffering that was intended to break your capacity for the calling, God was using to build a specific dimension of that capacity that nothing else could have built. Every rejection that was designed to wound your sense of worth to the point where you would never step into the authority of what you carry, God was using to strip away the kind of people-dependent, approval-seeking, belonging-hungry orientation that would have made you ineffective in a calling that requires the freedom to move in God's direction, regardless of whether the people around you receive it or reject it. The enemy built the wound. God built the weapon. and the weapon is made from the wound in a way that is so specific, so precise, so intimately connected to the exact nature of what the calling requires, that the chosen person who finally sees it clearly cannot help but stand in something that is equal parts grief and worship. Grief for the child who carried what they carried without understanding why, and worship for the God who was present in every moment of the carrying and was working in every moment of what the carrying was doing to them. Psalm 34:18 is one of the most personally tender verses in the entire scripture, and it deserves to be received not as a general statement about God's character, but as a specific present tense address to the chosen person who is reading this right now with wounds from their childhood that have not yet fully healed. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Near to the brokenhearted, not distant from them, not waiting for them to heal before he draws close. Near, present. In the specific geography of the brokenness itself, in the exact place where the wound lives, in the interior room that the chosen person has sometimes been afraid to let God into because what is in that room is too raw and too old and too much, and they are not entirely sure they can survive the opening of it. He is already in that room. He has been in that room since the wound was first inflicted. And what he is doing in there is not merely comforting the broken person until they are well enough to be useful. He is building something in the broken-hearted place from the crushed spirit. He is constructing the very weapons that the calling requires, and the construction is happening in the wound because that is the only place those specific weapons can be made. The chosen who were wounded in childhood in the specific areas of their identity, their sense of belonging, their capacity to trust, their ability to receive love without bracing for its withdrawal, carry those wounds into adulthood and into their ministry in ways that the wounds of less intimate areas of life do not produce in the same way. The wound to the identity produces a person who has spent their life uncertain of who they are, which in the hands of God becomes a person who has been so thoroughly emptied of the false self that the palace builds and the approval of the world maintains that there is nothing left but the identity that God gives. The identity that cannot be taken by rejection or dismantled by the withdrawal of belonging because it was never dependent on those things in the first place. The wound to trust produces a person who has learned, through the most costly possible kind of learning, that human beings are not the ultimate foundation for a life, which in the hands of God becomes a person whose trust in God is not theoretical or borrowed from someone else's testimony, but is the specific, hard-won, personally authenticated trust of someone who has been to the place where every other foundation failed and found that God's foundation did not. The wound to the capacity to receive love produces a person who has had to learn to receive grace rather than earn acceptance, which in the hands of God becomes one of the most effective ministers of grace available, because the person who has had to learn grace the hard way understands at a depth that the person who received it easily never quite reaches what it actually costs to give it and what it actually means to receive it. Now, there is a chosen person this teaching needs to speak to with particular directness, and it is the chosen person who was never told what they were carrying. Not once. Not by a parent who saw the marking and named it. Not by a pastor or a teacher or a mentor who recognized what was operating in the child in front of them and gave it the language and the biblical framework and the spiritual affirmation that would have made the carrying so much more bearable. Not by anyone. The chosen child who felt different and spiritual and compassionate and called and was simply never told what any of it meant, who grew up in an environment that was either too spiritually immature to recognize what God had placed in them, or too spiritually shallow to know that such things could be placed in a child, or too broken and preoccupied with its own survival to have the margin to look at the child in front of them and say, "I see what is in you, I see the marking, I see the hand of God on your life, and I want you to know that what you are carrying is real and it matters, and God is in it." That absence, the absence of the person who should have seen and named and affirmed what was in the chosen child, is itself a wound that deserves to be acknowledged before it can be properly healed. Because it is not a small thing to carry something significant from childhood with no one to interpret it for you. It is not a small thing to feel the weight of a calling without anyone around you who can tell you that the weight is real and that you were made for it, and that the God who placed it in you did not make a mistake when he chose you to carry it. The absence of that voice in the formative years of a chosen person's life leaves a specific kind of gap that the chosen person then spends years unconsciously trying to fill, looking for the father figure or the spiritual mentor or the community that will finally see them and name them and tell them with the authority of genuine spiritual discernment that what they have been feeling since childhood is real. Some of the chosen find that person. Many of them search for a very long time before they do. And some of them arrive in adulthood still carrying the original childhood wound of the unseen and unnamed calling, still waiting for the voice that should have spoken over them in their youth. To that chosen person, this teaching is now that voice, not as a substitute for the human community and the genuine spiritual mentorship that the chosen still need and still deserve and should still actively seek, but as a direct, prophetic, spirit-backed address to the specific wound of the child who was never told. You were marked. You were always marked. The difference you felt was real. The spiritual hunger that preceded instruction was real. The compassion that felt too heavy for a child was real. The dreams and the visions and the awareness of the spiritual realm that you learned not to talk about were real. The knowing that you were made for something more was real. All of it was real. All of it was the hand of God on a life he had already decided was his before that life had the opportunity to prove itself worthy of his choice. And the fact that nobody around you in your childhood had the eyes to see it or the language to name it does not mean it was not there. It was there. It has always been there. And God himself is naming it now, in this moment, through this teaching, with the full weight of a father who sees what was placed in you before you were born and has never stopped seeing it through every season of your life, including the seasons in which the absence of human recognition made you wonder whether what you were feeling was real at all. Isaiah 49:1 carries the word that the chosen who were never told need to receive as the direct address it always was. Listen, O coastlands, to me, and take heed, you peoples from afar. The Lord has called me from the womb, from the matrix of my mother, he has made mention of my name. From the womb he made mention of my name. Before there was a community to affirm it. Before there was a mentor to name it. Before there was a church to recognize it or a prophet to speak it over a congregation. God had already mentioned the name. He had already called from the womb. The calling did not require human recognition to be real. It did not need the affirmation of the right spiritual authority figure to be valid. It was established in the womb by the only one whose establishment of it was ever going to be sufficient. And the decades of human silence around it did not change what God had spoken over it before a single human being had the opportunity to respond. He named you, he called you, he marked you, and no absence of human recognition, however long and however painful, has the authority to undo what God decided in the womb. There is something that has been happening in you throughout this entire teaching, and it deserves to be named before anything else is said. From the moment the hook described a child who always felt different, something began to move in you. Not just in your mind, not just in the analytical part of you that was tracking with the content and finding it theologically sound and well supported by scripture. Something moved deeper than that, in the place where the old wounds still live, in the place where the child you were is still waiting for someone to walk in and finally tell them the truth about what they were carrying and why. Recognition landed in that place. The quiet, undeniable, spirit-confirmed recognition of a person who is hearing their own story told clearly for the first time, and who is discovering in the hearing of it that the story they have been living with all these years, the story of the child who was too different and too sensitive and too much and never quite enough and never quite belonging anywhere, was never the real story. It was the enemy's version of it, And this teaching has been giving you God's version. And God's version changes everything. You recognized yourself in the 7 signs, in the difference that no social or psychological explanation ever fully accounted for, in the spiritual hunger that was present before anyone handed you the language of faith, in the compassion that absorbed other people's pain in a way that felt too heavy for a child's body to carry, in the suffering and the loss that marked your early years in ways that still leave their fingerprint on how you move through the world today, in the dreams and the visions and the spiritual awareness that you learned to carry in silence, because the world around you did not have the container for them, in the rejection that went so deep because what was being rejected was not something peripheral, but something essential, the very thing God had placed in you that the enemy needed to wound before it could fully emerge, and in the knowing, that persistent, impossible to permanently silence knowing that you were made for something more than the life that was being offered to you, the knowing that everyone around you called arrogance and that God was always calling accuracy. This teaching has named what was in you before you had the language for it. And now, before we go any further, it is time to respond. Not with more receiving, not with more content, not with the next section of teaching that will add more framework to what has already been poured out. It is time to pray. Because everything that has been named in this teaching, every sign, every wound, every word spoken over the chosen child who was never told what they were carrying, deserves more than intellectual agreement. It deserves the full, open, honest, unhurried response of a heart that has just been seen clearly and is ready, perhaps for the first time, to be fully held by the God who has been seeing it all along. Stay with me. The prayer is next. Before you pray this prayer, I want you to do something that the busyness of your life has probably made difficult for a long time. I want you to be still. Not the kind of still that is simply the absence of physical movement while the interior is still racing. The real kind. The kind where you let the noise settle, where you let the defenses come down, where you stop managing your presentation even before God and simply arrive in His presence as the person you actually are, with the history you actually have, with the wounds that are actually still there underneath everything you have built over them. That is the person He wants to pray this prayer. Not the polished version, not the version that has it together, the real one, the one who recognized themselves in every sign this teaching named. Bring that person to this prayer and pray every word of it with the full weight of your heart. Father, I come to you in this moment as someone who has just heard their own story told, and I am undone by the telling of it. I did not expect to feel what I am feeling right now. I did not expect to sit with the teaching and find myself at the end of it with tears I cannot fully explain and a recognition so deep that it has reached places in me that I did not know were still waiting to be reached. But you knew. You knew exactly what this moment would do in me before I arrived in it, because you have always known me in a way that I am only beginning to understand. And what I am understanding right now, more clearly than I have ever understood it before, is that you have been present in my life since before I had the consciousness to register your presence. Before the womb, you knew me. Before the first breath, you marked me. Before I had a single experience of the world that would shape me, you had already decided what you were going to do with me and through me and in me, and nothing that the world did to me in the years that followed, nothing that the enemy deployed against the foundations of my life, nothing that the silence of the people who should have named what was in me but did not. Nothing changed what you decided before it all began. I receive that today, Lord, not as theology, as truth that is landing in the deepest room of my interior life and doing something there that I cannot fully articulate, but that I know is real. I bring my childhood before you now, Father, and I do not come to you with it in the way I have sometimes come before, carrying it as a wound to be explained or a grievance to be processed or a set of experiences to be somehow reconciled with the idea of a good God who was supposedly present through all of it. I come to you with it differently today. I come to you with it as material, as the raw, broken, costly, irreplaceable material from which you have been building something in me that I am only now beginning to see clearly. And I ask you to do in this moment what only you can do, which is to take every experience of my early life that I have been holding as evidence of abandonment and show me in it the fingerprints of your presence. Take the places where I felt most alone and show me where you were standing in them. Take the wounds that were inflicted against my foundations and show me what you were building in me through the very experiences that were designed to destroy me. Take the childhood I had and give me the eyes to see it the way you see it, not as the damaged prelude to a life that has had to overcome its beginnings, but as the specific, intentional, sovereignly orchestrated preparation of a God who knew exactly what he was doing in every season of it, including the ones that felt most like you had looked away. I bring the wound of feeling different before you, Lord. The years of not quite belonging, of existing at an angle to the world around me that I could feel but could never fully explain, of trying to make myself fit into shapes that were never designed for me and failing in that attempt with a consistency that eventually stopped feeling like failure and started feeling like something permanent about me. I bring that wound before you and I ask you to heal it at the root. Not to remove the difference, because I understand now that the difference was the marking, and the marking is not something I want removed, but to heal the shame that attached itself to the difference in the years when I did not yet understand what the difference was for. Let me wear the difference differently from this day forward, Lord. Not as the evidence of something wrong with me, but as the evidence of something intentional about me. The fingerprint of a God who set me apart before I was born for a purpose that required a person who was willing to be exactly what I am. I bring the wound of the rejection before you, Father. The specific, personal, goes-to-the-bone rejection of the child who was never quite received by the environments they moved through, whose essential self was the very thing that the world around them did not have the capacity to hold. I am not going to minimize it before you today, Lord, because you do not need me to minimize it in order to redeem it, and I do not need to minimize it in order to receive the redemption. It hurt. It left marks that are still present in the way I sometimes hesitate before I step forward, in the way I still brace for the withdrawal of belonging, even in the environments that have received me. In the way there is a part of me that is still waiting for the confirmation that I am actually wanted here. Heal that part today, Father. Speak into the place where the rejection did its deepest work and say what you have always said about me, what you said before the rejection arrived, and what you have never stopped saying through every season of it. That I am chosen, that I am wanted, that I belong to you with a permanence and a completeness that no human rejection has ever had the authority to revoke. Let that word land in the deepest place the rejection ever reached, and let it be louder there than everything the rejection said. I bring the suffering of my early years before you, Lord, and I lay it down in this moment with the specific, deliberate, faith-requiring act of a person who has decided to trust the God who is present in it. I do not fully understand all of it yet. I may not fully understand all of it on this side of eternity, but I choose today to receive Romans 8:28, not as a comfortable theological abstraction, but as a personal, present tense, applies to my specific story declaration that all things, including the things that happened to me in the years before I was old enough to make sense of them, are working together for a good that is bigger than my ability to see it clearly from where I am standing. I trust you with the suffering, Father. I trust you with the chapters of my childhood that still have questions attached to them that I have not yet received answers to. And I declare that the wounds of those chapters are not the final word over my story, because you are the author of my story, and you do not end stories in wounds. You end them in the beauty that Isaiah 61:3 promises. Beauty for ashes, the oil of joy for mourning, the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness. I receive that exchange today. Every ash of my childhood, every place where something was burned down that should have been standing, I bring it to you and I ask you to do what only you can do, which is make something beautiful from it that could not have been made any other way. To every sign that this teaching named, Father, I say yes. Yes to the difference and the spiritual hunger and the compassion and the suffering and the dreams and the visions and the rejection and the knowing. Yes to all of it, as the marking of a God who decided about me before the foundation of the world and has been faithful to what he decided through every season of a life that has not always looked like it was going somewhere, but has always been going somewhere, because you have always been in it. I receive the calling today, Lord, not with the performance of a person who is trying to be worthy of it, but with the surrender of a person who understands that the worthiness was never the point. You did not choose me because I was worthy. You chose me because you chose me before I existed, before I had done anything to qualify or disqualify myself, before the wounds were inflicted or the gifts were developed or the formation was complete. You chose me, and you have been faithful to that choice through everything. And I choose you back today, with the full weight of everything I am and everything I have been through and everything I am still becoming. I choose you, and I say yes to everything you marked me for before I was born. I release the years I spent trying to be something other than what you made me. I release the energy I gave to fitting into shapes that were never designed for me. I release the shame of the difference and the grief of the rejection and the confusion of the childhood that made no sense until this teaching gave it a language. I release it all, Father, and I receive in its place the identity that was decided in the womb, the calling that was established before the foundation of the world, the purpose that survived everything the enemy threw against it and is still standing, still real, still coming, still moving toward the fullness of what you decided before I took my first breath. I am your chosen. I have always been your chosen. And I will spend the rest of my life walking in what you marked in me before the beginning of it. In the name of Jesus Christ, who was himself marked before the foundation of the world, and who knows better than anyone what it costs to carry a calling that the world was not ready to receive. Amen. If this teaching has done something real in you today, if something shifted in the place where the old wounds live and the recognition of God's hand on your childhood landed in a way that is still settling into you, do not let this moment pass without doing two things. Like this video and subscribe to this channel, because what was poured out in this teaching is not a one-time word. There is more coming. There is more that the chosen need to hear about who they are, what they carry, and what God has been building in them through every season of a life that was marked before it began. Every teaching on this channel exists for that single purpose: to give the chosen the language and the biblical foundation and the prophetic clarity to finally understand their own story and to walk in it with the full confidence of a person who knows that the God who marked them before the foundation of the world has never once changed his mind about them. Stay connected. Share this with the chosen person in your life who has been carrying their childhood alone and has never been told what they were carrying. They need to hear this. And what God has next for this channel is worth staying for.